Today, we will continue on with our series on 1 Corinthians, and today we are the 9th chapter. And the title of our message for this morning is this: Church Unity, Members Appreciating Their Pastors, and Pastors Sacrificing for the Gospel. Let me read that to you again. The title of our message this morning is Church Unity, Members Appreciating Their Pastors, and Pastors Sacrificing for the Gospel, taken from 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 1 to 23. And I'm reading to you from the ESV, or the English Standard Version. Verse 1 says, "Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are not you my workmanship in the Lord? If to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you. For you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord." Verse 3. "This is my defense to those who would examine me. Do we not have the right to eat and drink? Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas," who is Peter? So in other words, Peter was actually married. "Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense?" Of course, no one, because you have to have someone funding you if you have to have an army. "Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? Or who tends a flock without getting some of the milk?" Verse 8. "Do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, 'You shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain.' Is it for oxen that God is concerned? Does he not really speak for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope that the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you?" Verse 12. "If others share this rightful claim on you, do we not even more? Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar in the sacrificial offerings? In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. But I have made no use of any of these gifts, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision. For I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting." Of course, this is the good kind of boasting. No? Verse 16. "For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting, for necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this on my own will, I have a reward. But if not on my own will, kung napipilitan lang, I'm still entrusted with a stewardship. What then is my reward? That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel," the right to make a living due to the gospel. "For though I am free for all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them." Verse 20. "To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not myself being under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some." Finally, in verse 23, it says this: "I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings." May the Lord add his blessings upon the reading of his word, and all of us will say. I'd like to review with you the core lessons that we have learned from the first 6 chapters of 1 Corinthians. And these are the core lessons from 1 Corinthians 1 to 6. Lesson number 1, there was disunity taking place. And this disunity in the church was taking place due to the lack of godly wisdom among the Corinthian believers. They had factions. They were acting unwisely because they chose to follow this person. They were in church because of their loyalties to persons, and this showed how immature they actually were. Verse 2. There was the unrepentance of a man who was committing sexual immorality, and the leaders of the church did not know how to deal with him. Lesson number 3. There were conflicts among the believers, and the believers actually sued each other. They took each other to court. Now let's learn from the lesson of 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And the lesson of 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is this. It is God's desire for Christians to stay true to their calling as part of the united body of Christ, whether they are married or not. It is God's desire, whether you are a single person or you a married person, to stay true with your calling, whether it causes you to be called as a preacher. If you are a single person, then preach as a single person. If you are a married person, then preach as a married person. If you are a missionary who is a single person, be a missionary. If you are a single person, if you are married, be a missionary nevertheless. So it is God's desire for Christians to stay true to their calling as part of the united body of Christ, whether they are married or not. And the lesson from 1 Corinthians 8, which you actually took up last week, is this. A mature believer sets aside certain freedoms that are allowed for the sake of those whose faiths are still weak, in order for the unity of the church to be preserved. Let me say that again. A mature believer sets aside certain freedoms that are allowed for the sake of those whose faiths are still weak. For instance, Paul was citing the use of food which was offered to idols. But let's take this for example. If, for instance, you as a Christian enjoy red wine, for instance. If you as a Christian enjoy red wine, but if you invite to your house another brother or a sister who has had a struggle with alcohol, it would be godly and it would be considerate for us not to serve wine when that brother or sister is present in our home. That's what it means when we set aside certain freedoms, because we are considerate with the struggles of those who are yet to mature in their faith. And the lesson for today in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 is this. After having defended, or after having stated that we should be considerate to those who are weak in faith, Paul defends himself against those who, because of the weakness of their faith, question his apostolic authority and the need to provide material support to him. So in other words, there were those of weak faith among the people in Corinth who were questioning, why should we consider him or regard Paul as an apostle? And therefore, if he's not a true apostle, why should we even consider supporting him materially? It was this that made Paul ask the question, am I not free? Am I not a real apostle? And he goes and says that I have actually seen the Lord. Meaning to say that is the principal criteria for being an apostle, is that you have to have had witnessed the actual presence of Jesus Christ. And he claims, and his statement is, I actually saw Jesus Christ. Because you know that, because that was what happened to him when he came from Damascus. So that was what happened to him. Now, Paul defends himself against those who, because of their weakness of their faith, in other words, because of their narrowness of mind, he defends himself against those people who question his apostolic authority and the need to provide material support to him. He was being questioned, why should we even consider him as a pastor of our church, let alone an apostle? Now, the sad reality is this. Ito po, no? Shinare ko kay Pastor Vic ito kanina, no? In some churches, by the grace of God, bread from heaven is not this, no? In some churches, it is traditionally believed that those who have been called to minister should only receive a small compensation regardless of the amount of work and the quality of their work. Yun ang mindset. Pastor ka lang. Madali ang trabaho mo. You have 6 days to prepare for your message. On one day, on a Sunday, madali ang trabaho mo. Pagka tinawagan ka, makikipag-usap ka lang. Pagka halimbawa kailangan ng counseling, makikipag-counsel. That is the mindset. In some churches, it is traditionally believed that the authority or the position of a pastor is not vital for the church. So yun ang nangyayari. Another sad reality, the opposite naman, is this. In other churches, the ministers and pastors believe that they are entitled to a hefty compensation because they feel that the church will not simply survive without them, not considering the fact that God is the one who guides the church. So, balanse po. By the grace of God, balanse ang ating message ngayon. Now, the period of reviewing and renewing a pastor's appointment and his compensation should always be a time for prayer and self-examination, both for the pastor and his family and the appointing body of a given church. It should be a time for prayer and self-examination. Why is this? Because it is during this time that a pastor would have to take stock of his motives for accepting a call or renewing a call. It is during this time na kailangan iluhod niya sa Panginoon. Should I accept the call? Should I ask for this or should I ask for that? And it is also a time for the appointing body, the board of the church, the board of elders and deacons, or the consistory in the Reformed tradition. It should be a time for the consistory to pray as to whether or not is God giving us, speaking to us that we should graciously give more to our pastor, or let's evaluate and decide otherwise. So this should be a very, very crucial time, the period of reviewing. And by the grace of God, again, I would say that the Lord has been good to us in bread from heaven, and He has given us wisdom to decide glorifyingly to Him. Now, it is also possible that this period of renewal and review may sometimes be the source of tension and conflict within the church. Because if the talks or the negotiations break down, it is almost inevitable that some sectors of the church will find out. And then hurts and sentiments will crop up. And then when these things do, it is almost inevitable that there will be, alam niyo na, magsasalita, bakit ganun lang ang binigay o bakit hindi ni-renew, without actually understanding the ins and outs, and there will be conflict and disunity. Therefore, we submit this thesis for us today, which is, of course, the main transition statement. The thesis is this: the proper appreciation of pastors and ministry laborers and the sacrificial commitment of pastors to the preaching of the gospel is important to the unity of the local church. Let me say that again. The gracious appreciation of pastors and ministry laborers and hindi po and ora, and the sacrificial commitment of pastors to the preaching of the gospel is important to the unity of the local church. Now, it leads me to ask this question. What must therefore we know? Therefore, what must we know about properly appreciating our pastors and ministry laborers? And what must pastors know about sacrificial commitment to preaching the gospel to the local church? So, our main transition question based on our MTS seeks to answer two things. Two things, no? Concerning two different parties in the church. What must we, the members, or us, the members, know about properly appreciating our pastors, and what must pastors know? So, balance lang po, no? I'd like to say this. I'd like to make a point of clarification. May kasabihan po sa English, this is a saying in English, I have no dog in this fight, if it is a fight, no? I have no dog in this fight. A point of clarification and disclosure. My preaching here po, in front of you, I am one of 3 pastors who are what we call as tent makers. So we do not receive support from the church. It is God has called us to speak His word, but God has also been good. That includes Elder Mario here. God has called us to preach, but He has made provision for us by some other way. So there are also pastors, some of our ordained pastors here, who are actually given by the church compensation, just compensation, because it is the belief of the church that we should justly remunerate or reward our pastors. So, ano lang po ha, again, ulitin ko po yung sinasabi ko. I have no dog in this fight if it is a fight at all. It's not a fight. I'm just saying that I'm going to be impartial here, and I'm going to address how the church should think and how the pastors should think. Okay po ba? Okay. Okay, Pastor Vic? Okay, Pastor Abel? Okay. So, guys, okay? Okay tayo? All right. So therefore, let's go back to the main transition question. What must we know about properly appreciating our pastors and ministry laborers? And what must pastors know about sacrificial commitment to preaching the gospel to the local church? First, it is consistent with God's will that His servants be justly rewarded for their labors. Babasahin ko po ulit, very slowly. Read this with me very, very slowly, especially the red part. It is consistent with God's will that His servants be justly rewarded for their labors. Reading to you from verses 13 and 14 where it says, "Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple? And those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? In the same way, the Lord," not anybody else, "the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel." So what does this mean? Well, first of all, just compensation of the laborers and the pastors in church is based on the principle of sowing and reaping. Do you remember what the principle of sowing and reaping is? Okay. The negative aspect of the principle of sowing and reaping has to do with sin, right? Galatians 6:7, sabi ni Paul, remember, tandaan, God is not mocked when we sin. For whatever we sow, we shall reap. Conversely, or by the opposite token, if we sow something good, then we should be able to reap something good. So it is a principle that God has organically assigned for us because He Himself is the sower and the reaper. Why? Because He allows for rain to come on His plants. He is the one that sows. He is the one who lets the seasons pass. So when the time for harvesting is there, the fruit is ripe for the picking. Nakuha niyo pa? So these are things that God has put in nature. Just compensation of the laborers and pastors in church is based on the principle of sowing and reaping. Alam niyo, mahina ako sa economics eh. Kaya this is actually one of the things that I do not like to preach, especially when it comes to money. I'm a little uncomfortable when it comes to money, but nevertheless, God has placed us here. So therefore, a local church is able to bless its pastors materially based on the material blessings given to it by God. So, ibig sabihin, if a church is materially blessed, therefore, ang principle ng covenant is, we are blessed to be a blessing. Therefore, we should be able to bless in kind. Materially, that is. A local church is able to bless its pastors materially based on the material blessings given to it by God. Now, Corinth, the church of Corinth, is a church which is fairly affluent. Although hindi lahat mayaman, pero Corinth was a church which is fairly affluent. So, iyon ang ano. I'd like to share with you a true story. A true story about a local church and how the members treated their pastor. Now, there's a local church, somewhere here in the south. There's a local church who was started by a family. Now, the family has become a dominant presence in that particular church. And since the family became very, very dominant, the leaders of the church were also influenced by the family. Now, ang nangyari is this. Every time, they have probably been in existence for almost, siguro halos kasabay natin, more than, how many years have we been in existence? 40? Almost 4 decades. Halos kasabayan natin. And this family and the generations that followed actually were considered as the runners or the trendsetters of the church, the decision makers in the church. And in as many years as they have been in existence, there were as many pastors. So practically every year, nagkakaroon ng bagong pastor. Now, why is this so? I'd like to tell you about the story because This family actually believed, as I illustrated to you earlier, that pastors or ministry workers are not really important. They feel that they are entitled, it has been a culture in this church that they feel that they are entitled to listen to a sermon, a sound sermon given by a pastor. That's why the compensation is maliit. Hanggang ganun lang. So small that the wife of the pastor had to take on odd jobs such as washing clothes, being a nanny for some members in the church. Ganun na nangyari. No? So therefore, the church has actually never grown. For the simple reason that if God, and this is an affluent church, it is made up of affluent families, and the church has never grown. And it has never made an impact in its community for the gospel. And the reason for that is it has defied God's laws of sowing and reaping. In other words, they violate the covenant principle that if you are blessed, you should be a blessing. So yun ang nangyayari. So therefore, if by the grace of God, bread from heaven continues on, it is our prayer that the congregation of Bread from Heaven will surpass even its gracious heart as of the moment. That we will be able to appreciate and care for our pastors. Again, hindi po kami, we are not compensated here. I just would like to make that clear, no? Hindi po kasama kami doon. But I would like to encourage our congregation, appreciate your pastors, materially or otherwise. Better kung materially, lalo na pag may pangangailangan. So, therefore, it is a summary, what I just said is a summary of our first point, which is this. It is consistent with God's will that His servants be justly rewarded for their labors. Second, it is consistent with God's will that the pastors who were called believe that the preaching of the gospel should be its own reward. Medyo malamang po yan, no? So, ulitin natin, ha? It is consistent with the will of God that the pastors who are called, and I'm assuming all pastors who are preaching are called, that the pastors who were called believe and are convinced that the preaching of the gospel should be its own reward. Reading to you from verses 15 to 18 where it says, "But I have made no use of any of these rights." Si Paul, after having submitted the thesis that pastors should be justly compensated, he makes a U-turn. "But I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provisions. For I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting. For necessity is laid upon me." O nga naman, pagka talagang halimbawa under contract ka or under ano ka, there is a necessity for you to preach the gospel. "Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel, for if I do this on my own will, I have a reward, but if not of my own will, I am still entrusted with the stewardship." May kontrata. "What then is my reward?" he asks. "That in my preaching, I may present the gospel," what? "Free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel." So therefore, what was he talking about? Ano itong boasting na sinasabi niya na ito? Hindi masasabi ng mga kumi-question sa kanya na tumatanggap ka ng pera kaya ka nagpipreach ng gospel. We question your apostolic authority. Therefore, we have the right to question you if you are accepting remuneration for preaching the gospel. But he says this, "Since I do not accept and I preach the gospel free of charge, I can boast and say that no one can accuse me that I am preaching for money." Yun yung sinasabi niya. So, though Paul received material support from the church in Philippi, he did, no? He did not receive a support from Corinth. Though Paul received material support from the church in Philippi and from a few other supporters, he refused to receive material support from the church in Corinth. And why was this? I just answered the question. Because Paul understood the immaturity of faith among some in the Corinthian church who questioned his authority. In other words, this has still something to do with the laying aside of the freedoms that he has had. He is supposed to be free by virtue of the principle of sowing and reaping na tumanggap ng compensation from the church. But he is setting this aside because he knows na makaka-istumble siya sa faith ng mga hindi nakakaintindi na kailangan kang tumanggap ng compensation. So he's setting this aside. And even at the expense of himself, his principal concern was the faith of the immature. So do we get this? Yun ang kanyang principal issue here. So Paul understood the immaturity of faith among some in the Corinthian church who questioned his authority. Mga kapatid, it is inevitable that in church, this is a consequence of us being able to deal or having to deal with our sinful nature. It is inevitable that in church or in any Christian group that there will be those who have a more mature understanding or have a more mature faith, and there will be those na hindi pa masyado. So, the job or the task of the mature is to make sure that those who do not understand are not stumbled. Hindi sila natatalisod. Wala silang ground para questionin ang integrity ng isang person who claims to speak for God. So therefore, yun ang kino-consider ni Paul. So therefore, it is also important for me to say this, that it is important for pastors to know. I will say this very slowly and very carefully. It is important for pastors to know that in some situations, sacrifices will have to be made to be able to silence the issues raised by believers with immature faith. And in some instances, being a bivocational pastor may be the model for ministry in some instances. So Bread from Heaven is made up of both univocational and bivocational pastors. Univocational are those who are trained, seminary trained, and they preach uncompromisingly the gospel of Jesus Christ. And the bivocs or the bivocationals are those who have not been probably trained in seminary, but at the same time, they make their living not from the gospel. But either way, the Bible tells us that it is good. But in some instances, and this is one instance, if you are facing the church, which is something like this, like the church in Corinth, a bivocational pastor may be the model for ministry. So, to our pastors and pastors in training, let me say this. Before accepting a call from a local church, it is important for us to know the history and the level of maturity of the congregation that we are about to pastor. We should have a good grasp on a good knowledge. Sa corporate world po, meron yung tinatawag na the concept of fit. Am I a good fit for the church based on its history and based on the level of maturity of the congregation? And if we ask God for wisdom, He will reveal these things to us. Therefore, this is a summary of the second point, which is this. It is consistent with God's will that the pastors who were called believe that the preaching of the gospel should be its own reward. And finally, third point. It is consistent with God's will that the pastors who were called believe that they should be able to relate to all kinds of people for the sake of the gospel, even to those who do not like them. Meron pala nun sa church, no? Natatawa si Pastor Vic. It is consistent with God's will that the pastors who were called believe that they should be able to relate. In other words, have good relationships with all kinds of people for the sake of the gospel, even to those who don't like them in the context of the church. Reading to you from verses 20 to 23 where it says, to the Jews, I became as a Jew to what? In order to win Jews. To those under the law, I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law. That what? That I might win those under the law. And he's talking about the church. These people are present in church. To those outside the law, the Gentiles in church, I became as one outside the law, not being outside of the law of God, but under the law of Christ. That I might win those outside the law. To the weak, I became weak that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. And what? I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. It should be understood by pastors that what? Relational skills are part of faithfully proclaiming the gospel. Totoo ba yan? Especially with those with vast experiences in the pastorate, relational skills are part of faithfully proclaiming the gospel, because sometimes the gospel is shared relationally. For those who would probably, in certain cultures, the in-your-face sharing of the gospel might work. But in our culture, Filipinos are very relational, so it is essential that relational skills be part of faithfully proclaiming the gospel. Because through the preaching of the gospel, though it may be offensive, we should develop character that is winsome to many. Part of the sharing of the gospel, if sometimes we are offensive behind this, if we bang the pulpit because we are stressing a point about atonement, about the horrors of sin, it becomes a different story when we step down. So, sa pulpit lang po iyon. Hindi po kami ganon sa labas. That's only in the pulpit. So, you can approach us anytime. We can talk anytime, have coffee anytime, eat anytime, discuss anything anytime you like. So, it should be understood by pastors and in training that relational skills are part of being a faithful witness of the gospel. And though the preaching of the gospel may be offensive, we should develop the character skills that will win many to Christ. So in summary, let me say and summarize the MTS and the MTQ, where it says, the proper appreciation of pastors and ministry laborers and the sacrificial commitment of pastors to the preaching of the gospel is important to the unity of the local church. And what must we know about properly appreciating our pastors and ministry laborers, and what must pastors know about sacrificial commitment to preaching the gospel to the local church? Let's read together. 1, 2, ready, read. It is consistent with God's will that His servants be justly rewarded for their labors. Second, it is consistent with God's will that the pastors who were called believe that the preaching of the gospel should be its own reward. And third, it is consistent with God's will that the pastors who were called believe that they should be able to relate to all kinds of people for the sake of the gospel, even to those who don't like them. Is it easy? Is it easy for the leadership of Bread from Heaven by the grace of God? And I've been a part of the leadership of Bread from Heaven from 2003 to 2008. And I'd like to say that I've never been with a more generous bunch of leaders that I've had the pleasure of working with. Leaders who are understanding of grace, leaders who have empathy, and at the same time, leaders who are fair. And it is consistent, as I said, no, that for pastors, the modeling of our late Pastor Doy is this. The preaching of the gospel should be its own reward. Pastor Doy has shared that with us, and he passed that down to us, na the gospel should be preached regardless. And of course, the pastors, Pastor Doy was also good at this, because even to those who did not appreciate him, he had the relational skills to actually relate with them or cope with them, if you'd like. No? So, this is what we have for today. Let's pray. Heavenly Father,